guest is Adam Bluhm. Adam is a senior cloud architect at AWS, specializing in generative AI. He is recognized for his contributions to Gen AI, including leading the establishment of the Space and Sensors Gen AI Center of Excellence and developing advanced agentic Gen AI solutions. In today's episode, we talk about the next iteration of Gen AI and its impact. Let's get started. Adam, thank you so much for coming to the podcast. Now, Gen AI, we see a lot of Gen AI content in social media, but it's a lot. Someone who is new to Gen AI, Adam, can you give them a roadmap?
Yeah, you don't need to be afraid to get started with Gen AI. You don't need to be a data scientist or a PhD in mathematics or even a bachelor's in mathematics to get started with generative AI. Because really there's kind of two sides to generative AI, right? There's the research side, which we hear about from a lot of the AI labs, and then there's the applied generative AI side. And that's kind of what I do and what a lot of folks do. The first area you'd probably want to start on is really understanding what a large language model is and what it isn't. Once you understand, have a good foundation of what a large language model is and what it isn't, and what I mean by that, by the way, is, understanding just kind of the inner workings of a large language model, especially from the not that you have to go super deep on the research side of like what's called the transformer architecture or a neural network, but really understanding the fact that when you prompt a model, when you input something into a model, that gets tokenized. What does that mean? To get tokenized, how does that work? The inputs and the outputs of the model, that's really important to understand as a solid foundation to how these models work and operate. And so that way you can know how to steer the behavior of those models and understand what the limitations are, at least today. And so I think after that, once you have a good solid foundation of how LLMs work, what they are, I think it's also really important to kind of dive a little deep into the ecosystem of the large language model. So understanding what are the different model providers out there? What is this open source kind of world? What is the first party world? All these proprietary models from like Anthropic and OpenAI to the open source models such as those from Meta, from Mistral. There's so many different model providers out there. I think diving into that, understanding what does that mean? What are the differences? What are the different capabilities? Why do people or customers choose one versus the other? I think that's a good starting point as well. And then I think, after that, going on this journey, I think as well, prompt engineering is a really, really important and critical aspect to generative AI skill sets, right? Like, at first you may think, well, as a technician or as an IT professional, you might think, oh, prompt engineering, you're just talking to the model in natural language. What's so hard about that? Well, actually, there's a lot to it. And there's been a lot of great research, a lot of great best practices out there around prompt engineering from like AWS, Anthropic, and other AI labs. Just a couple examples. When you prompt a model, prompt engineering, you really want to focus your prompt around your use case, because what you're doing is steering the model towards the outcomes you're looking for. You don't want to just kind of haphazardly prompt the model, assuming that the model just understands the nuances of what you're looking for. Just like you wouldn't, go to a friend or go to a coworker who's brand new to your team and just assume they can hit the ground running just like you can. You'd want to provide them some context, give them a role, give them maybe some examples of what right looks like or what it doesn't look like, and then telling the model to think step by step, although that's becoming less important now that we have what's called reasoning or thinking models. So prompt engineering is really important in a lot of ways, and I don't think that's going away anytime soon.
Got it. Okay, so I do have a question on this, on open source versus closed source, Adam. So what do you see like more popular, or what do you predict that what ecosystem will edge forward?
Yeah, I think as long as scaling holds up, like scaling in terms of the more compute and the more data, that if that continues to exponentially increase the performance and intelligence of these models and capabilities, I think that these first party models are going to continue to dominate the open source models in terms of just raw intelligence, raw ability. Like, for example, Meta just came out with Llama 4
Right.
their model, which is a really great open source model. But when you compare it to the benchmarks and especially real world use cases around, Anthropic's Claude 3.7 Sonnet model, which is their top model, or Nova Pro, or Gemini 2.5 Pro, for example, it just does not come close to a lot of real world capabilities. And so I think that, as long as these scaling laws hold up, I think that we'll continue to have these state of the art frontier models that will still be dominant over the open source models. But I do believe that there probably is a day when these models will be more commoditized and it'd be harder and harder to tell the difference between a first party model and an open source model in terms of just raw intelligence. There's going to be so many other features and nuances to that, I'm sure. But as of right now, there's a pretty big gap.
Got
Really depending on your use case too, I would say.
Yeah, the new Llama 4 model has like 10 million context window, 10 million words, right? But like I was studying that if the context window becomes super huge, sometimes the model ignore a lot of it and just go by the first and the last. Is that true?
Yeah, actually, that's really true. So with like Llama 4 having a 10 million contacts window, so that's a huge, huge window.
Right.
Like that's the biggest in the industry, which is awesome, especially since it's an open source model. But the benchmarks, what they show is that meta release show that it does a really good job not forgetting information in the middle of that 10 million context. But from what real world uses of Llama 4 and that 10 million context window are finding is that it has a hard time with like needle in the haystack problems, which means, let's say you have a super long set of PDFs or different types of data sets that are really, 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 really long. The
Mhm.
model will end up forgetting information in the middle of that context, and that's really bad because you want the model to be able to retain and understand, keep that knowledge information in its context window, so that way you can work with it. Imagine a really large code base in GitHub, for example. 10 million context window is amazing for that use case, but if it's forgetting the conversation you had as you're coding or as you're, refactoring your code base, I mean, that can lead to some pretty bad outcomes. And so, yeah, what's happening there is that Meta's model, in particular, is not as good as it looks like it is on paper. Yeah, and that's one of the challenges of these models, and I think that's why you see like Anthropic continue to stay within the few 100,000 context window because they've really nailed that to be very, very accurate at the 200 to 300,000 context window. There is rumors they're going to increase that to 500,000. Google Gemini has like 1 million, 2 million context window. If you think about this in traditional machine learning, there's like this concept of like noise, or overfitting even maybe, where if there's too much signal or too much data, that can kind of bring about inaccurate results. And so that's a big research problem that a lot of the AI labs are fighting right now.
Going back to open source and closed source, so I was studying a little bit of LangChain, LangGraph. So what do you see with customers, Adam? Like, do more customers do more on the open source ecosystem, Pinecone, LangChain, LangGraph, or they are more reliant on, let's say, like Bedrock, action groups, and all that stuff?
Yeah, I love that question because there's so many different use cases. It really depends, of course, on the use case and the
Mhm.
customer. But I would say a really common pattern is using Amazon Bedrock for inference because,
Mhm.
myself and a lot of customers I've worked with, they've done self-hosted models in EC2 or in ECS. They've also done on-prem models, and it is really expensive and it's really hard to scale those GPUs for dynamic workloads when you have users hitting that model, in spiky ways. And that's one of the areas that Amazon Bedrock really, really shines is because you pay per 1,000 tokens, you just pay for what you use, and it auto scales with your workload, which takes a lot of that heavy lifting away for you and makes it so much easier to build Gen AI applications. As far as agents go, Bedrock agents, it's fantastic. It really is. But I see a lot of customers using LangChain or LangGraph for agentic workloads, but using Amazon Bedrock for inference. I think one of the most common patterns is Amazon Bedrock for inference, so they can choose their model or models, and then they use LangChain or LangGraph for agents. but then they use Amazon Bedrock guardrails, for example, because it's really, really good, the best in the industry at what it does. They'll also use something like what's called model invocation logging, which is along the lines of security, the ability to capture your inputs and outputs into your model, as well as the metadata, which is really good to help you improve model performance. And it's also good from an auditability standpoint. And so I think it's really this mixture of open source and managed services where customers find the most success.
One of the reasons I love interviewing people like you, Adam, because you are actually working with customers and you have practical real world visibility. On that note, Adam, what Gen AI use cases come up the most in your customer conversations?
Yeah, I love talking to customers about this because generative AI is something that is really transforming IT, right? It's transforming everything. And so there's so many great stories and use cases with customers, but it all starts with your data. It all starts with your customers' data and that you or your customer's use case. And that's really where you want to start. You want to work backwards from that. But one of the most common use cases is definitely RAG, which stands for Retrieval Augmented Generation, this ability to upload your data, oftentimes like PDFs or text documents or Word documents to like a S3 bucket, for example, and then you put that data into a vector database, which can be like OpenSearch, it can be PG Vector. There's all sorts of different vector databases you can choose. But in Amazon Bedrock, we call that knowledge bases. But basically, it's RAG, this ability to have an LLM, a model, talk to your data. And that serves a number of really great low-hanging fruit use cases, right? Like in a chatbot example, like you think about HR, you think about a ticketing system or a help desk, being able to ground your model in your actual standard operating procedures or your best practices, data that doesn't change a lot, that can the model can reference for factual information. So that way the model's not hallucinating or getting things incorrectly to your end users. That's the most common use case, I would say.
Thank you for being a loyal listener to this podcast. If you want the latest cloud interview guide, including Gen AI interview questions and their answers, with average answers that most candidates give, and delightful answers that sets you apart and get you hired, go to cloudwithraj.com/newsletter. Again, cloudwithraj.com/newsletter. All right, back to the episode. You said RAG is one of the architectural patterns you see customers use. What are some of the other architectural patterns for enterprise customers that have success with for their Gen AI applications, Adam?
Yeah, I would say probably the second most popular one is tool use. There's different terms for this, like tool use or function calling, this ability to give your AI, your LLM, the ability to use a tool. I think probably the most popular tool would be text to SQL. So so many customers have SQL databases, right? And man, I personally believe that the average user, in a company, whether it's an analyst, a business user, or it doesn't matter who it is, should not have to learn SQL or shouldn't have to learn regular expression or some kind of complicated syntax just to find important business data or ask a question about data, right? They should be able to use natural language. And so I would say that's a really, really common one, is giving your AI a tool like text to SQL or text to Sparkle for knowledge graphs, or text to like API, allowing your LLM to call APIs. And that's also really popular. And that gives your AI some kind of agentic or agency to go ahead and query data where the data lives. That's really, really popular. And that complements RAG too.
So pulling that thread on that, so let's say text to SQL. Is that like a separate software and the LLM with agents just calling this software, this text to SQL, and that software is returning the SQL? Or is this capability inside the LLM where the user is saying, I want to see what customers bought my product, what is their age range, da 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 da, and is the LLM creating the SQL for them directly without the agentic workflow?
Yeah, oftentimes it's a Lambda function is where most customers like to have that text to SQL tool capability, and also some context for the model to understand how to use it. And it's often just querying, like reading from a database, as opposed to doing anything else like deleting or writing to a database to answer queries about data In the public sector, this can be something like natural disasters, for example, like historical records, stuff like that. Like how many times did natural disasters happen in this region of the world, for example, things like that, that is already in a SQL database is a really popular way to do that.
Okay, got it. So the SQL database is there, and then with action groups with Bedrock, it goes to the Lambda based on the prompt and the context. In the Lambda, we have SQL queries set up, and then it will just run the query, grab the data, and send it to the user. Is that the flow?
Yeah, that's generally the flow. Yeah, you can use Amazon Bedrock agents, and to your point, there's this concept called action groups within agents that allow you to have one to many different kind of function or tool calls, often using Lambda. That's really the way to go. And with Bedrock agents, and you can kind of think of anything that you want to give your agent access to, you'll be able to do that. And beyond just simple lambdas or complicated lambdas, Bedrock agents now supports something called model context protocol, or MCP, which we can get into as an advanced topic. But there's really, it's about bringing the AI to your data. RAG is awesome because you can ground your AI in your own data, but you don't really want to kind of duplicate data. If you already have data in a SQL database or a NoSQL database, for example, and you already have it well structured, or you have things set up and running, and you have a data pipeline putting data in there, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to duplicate that data to put that into a separate RAG database. In that case, it's a good idea to have a Bedrock agent to go ahead and go out to your data and do that text to SQL or text to whatever, that language, that query language is.
So let's talk a little bit about MCP, Adam. What is MCP and why is it so popular?
It is really popular. You're definitely spot on there. So Anthropic, one of the top AI companies, that creators of the Claude series of models, came out with this idea of something called Model Context Protocol. So one of the challenges to writing agent or creating agents, right? We talked about Lambda and tool use and function calls. That all works really well, but it's really hard to scale, especially in an enterprise setting. So, imagine yourself as an AI developer, and you want to access your company's SQL databases or RDS, whatever it is, you want to access that. Okay, so you write a custom function or custom tool in Lambda, and it works for your application. But then someone else in another department wants to access that same data. Someone else wants to access that same data. Well, how you wrote the tool is good for your use case, good for your application, but it may not be good for someone else in another department or for another use case. So writing these custom tools doesn't really scale that well. And it can vary depending on the model, depending on if you're self-hosting models or using Amazon Bedrock. There's lots of variability there. And so Anthropic's like, there's got to be a standard, a better way to do this. And so they came up with this kind of standardized way of doing this called Model Context Protocol, or MCP. And so it's a standardization of the way that large language models can communicate with data. So instead of putting the onus of coming up with custom code on the developer, now the responsibility is on the data owner. But that's a good thing because it allows these agents to scale across the enterprise or for your use case in a way that really wasn't that feasible before. And so to dive a little deeper on that, a good way to think of, or Anthropic calls it the USB-C for AI. I like to think of it like what REST API did for software development, MCP is going to be doing for agents, for AI agents, right? Having AI go out to your data. And the reason for that, within a MCP server, you have prompts, you have tool uses and resources. So imagine you have, a bunch of SQL databases or S3 buckets. It doesn't have to be databases, right? It could be, your GitHub or GitLab project. It could be almost any data resource that you want have an AI access. You put an MCP server in front of that. Maybe you run the NECS or an EKS or an EC2 instance, and you serve up an MCP server, and that MCP server will have prompts and resources and tools specific to your data. And now any agent application that wants to access that will be able to access that, and you can control the access patterns, the permissions, and things like that. And then on the software application side, that would be an MCP client, which is a bit of software that allows your large language model to be able to interact and know how to interact with that MCP server. So it's a client server architecture. And once you have that single line of code
Mhm.
to connect to that MCP server for your AI agent in your application on the development side, on the application side, your LLM will know what to do. It will connect to that MCP server. It will see the resources, the tools, maybe some prompts on how to interact with that data source. And your AI will know what to do with it. Your agent will know what to do with it. And you can have one to many different MCP server connections for your application. And it so really scales up data access. It's
Got it.
really, and it's still early days because it came out in November of last year. So a lot of development going on.
I like the line, what REST API did for software development, MCP will do for LLM applications. So when it comes to Gen AI, the security is one of the challenge. How can someone secure Gen AI workloads?
Yeah, great question. I mean, this is definitely a new emerging area. We work with some partners at AWS, like Hidden Layer and others, to help define this. But ultimately, it's a data problem, right? It's about your customer data or your own data when it comes to securing generative AI. First and foremost, I would say prompt engineering. There's something called the system prompt where you can steer the model's behavior. I think that's the first step. And then I think the second step, like a really good best practice, is applying guardrails to your AI. So that way, anybody that's prompting your model, especially in a enterprise setting or a business setting, or even if you're a startup, you want to control the inputs and the outputs in and out of the model. So that way, you ensure that the model is responding in a way that is aligned with your use case and not something that is maybe inappropriate or dangerous.
Got it. And is there any AWS tools that can help customers with this, Adam?
Yeah. So Amazon Bedrock, our managed service for serving up large language models, has some features and capabilities that are really great for securing generative AI capabilities, such as Amazon Bedrock guardrails, and that can help you protect against personal identifiable information as well as inappropriate content. You can also input your own keywords that you don't want the model to respond to. All sorts of great capabilities there. In fact, at reInvent, you may have seen automated reasoning checks, which is a really industry first for providing mathematical proof for making sure that the model is responding in a way that's more factual, which is really awesome. And then some other capabilities around security is, I would say, model evaluations. That's really important too.
No, I love the new reasoning checks. Stefano Bulliani was working on it, and he's the one who presented it. He's a legend in serverless world. He did a lot of the Lambda stuff. Very
Cool.
happy to see him now investing his time and energy into this Gen AI space. So we talked about MCP, we talked about RAG, Agentic AI. Any other Gen AI trends do you think will have a big impact for enterprise customers, Adam?
Yeah, I think so. I think MCP is the big one in terms of agentic
Mhm.
capabilities, but there's also some other things that touch on, such as agent orchestration. That's really important too. A really good practice to learn is, once you get comfortable creating an agent for a specific use case, try to think about like how can you scale that to multiple agents. And the reason why you'd want multiple agents over a single agent is because you don't want to confuse the large language model with too many different competing or too many different tasks, because what can happen is you can overwhelm a model if you put too much on it at once. And so a really good pattern is, maybe you have this agent that makes all the API calls for your use case, and this agent queries the SQL databases, and this agent maybe is the supervisor agent that coordinates those sub agents, right? So agent orchestration is a really powerful way to scale up agentic applications. And Amazon Bedrock has agent orchestration built in, and it makes it really easy to set that up. I think another advanced topic, less so than MCP for sure, is just to be aware of something called graph RAG. There was some research done, I believe about a year and a half or 2 years ago now, that kind of took RAG to the next level. So RAG, what that does is similarity search, right? So you upload like a PDF to a RAG database, for example, and it does what's called vector embeddings. And so it finds the similarity of that data, the contextual similarity. So it's really, really powerful. But what if you have, some PDFs on this subject, some PDFs on this subject, maybe you have some PowerPoints and some images and these different kind of data sets and that may not seem related at first, but maybe there is some relation there. A simple RAG database may miss those relationships. A knowledge graph was built from the ground up to understand those entities, right? And so a knowledge graph is a network of edges and nodes. And so it's really purpose built to understand relationships in data. So what GraphRag is, it combines the knowledge graph with a vector database or RAG into something called GraphRag. And so now you can look deep inside your data and understand the contextual similarity of your data, but also you can understand the relationships of your data. I think one kind of famous example is in the show Game of Thrones, there was a Starbucks coffee cup famously left in the production version, that they released on TV on HBO. Well, if you were to like possibly put that into a RAG database and try to get the LLM to understand why that's funny or what that means in, Starbucks with Game of Thrones, a medieval time period. Simple RAG and the LLM may miss the nuance there or the relationship there is why that's funny, but a graph RAG, may kind of connect the dots a bit better to give you, that understanding and that nuance in the relationship there. Also, if you're doing things like social networks or with with people and kind of subjects, knowledge graphs are really great for that too. So graph RAG is another one. And I guess one other thing that I'll say too here is really model and RAG evaluation. That's something that's really important to get your head around too as you get advanced in your Gen AI journey. Evaluating models continuously. Like I think about like a CI/CD pipeline when you're thinking about DevOps, right? You want to constantly always be iterating and improving, always testing. You kind of want to do that too with your models and your RAG databases as well, because there's something called model drift that can happen over time. Maybe the model starts to drift away from being really aligned or being really accurate with its responses. And so you want to constantly be evaluating like how can you improve? Maybe it's the prompt, maybe it's the data, maybe it's different types of knobs you can turn in terms of like temperature and different settings with models. So model performance is a really big one too. And I forgot to mention, sorry, running a little long here, but something that I think comes up a lot with customers, I think it's important to mention is fine tuning and distillation. So oftentimes I hear from customers like the first thing they want to do is, a lot of folks think that, oh, my data, no one else has data like me. And that's true, right? Like every customer does have their own unique data. You have your own unique data. However, very often what happens is customers believe that they need to go directly to fine tuning a model. And what that means is when you fine tune a model, you basically take a small percentage of the weights of a large language model and you retrain them the portion of that model to your data. And so a really great thing is when you fine tune a model, it becomes smarter on your data. The downside is it's a snapshot in time, right? So if your data updates or changes frequently, well, if you're fine tuning, you're going to fine tune again and again and again if you want that model to be updated. And also, when you fine tune a model, what can happen too is that it can lose some of its intelligence or its ability to generalize. So that's also a downside. Most of the time, you do not need to fine tune. RAG and agents and prompt engineering, those three things, prompt engineering being first, will get you very, 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 very far in 99% of use cases. I would say fine tuning is really something that you want to explore with your customers or your use case if you're just not getting the results out of the other three methods, prompt engineering, agents, and RAG. If you're really just not getting the performance there, then maybe fine tuning might be something to consider. A less known subject is model distillation, which Amazon Bedrock offers this as well as fine tuning. A model distillation is this idea of taking a really smart state-of-the-art frontier model like Claude 3.7 Sonnet or Nova Pro, and then distilling that intelligence into a smaller model, say Claude Haiku, and allowing that smaller model to have a much better level of intelligence with the benefit of lower latency, meaning the model will respond faster and lower cost. And that's also kind of a new kind of method.
with a Llama 4 10 million plus context window, is RAG still relevant, Adam, or
Oh yeah,
it's
that's a great
going?
question.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. RAG is definitely still relevant because, just like we have S3 buckets or we have databases, we want to keep data in the for the long term to be able to reference that data and find that data again, days, weeks, months, years later. So with the context window, once you go past that 10 million context window or any context window, or you start a new session, that's all gone. All that information is gone. And so you don't want to have your users re-uploading the same data over and over and over again. That would be a bad user experience. So in that case, you'd want to have that data in RAG. Now, if your customer or you want to build like a chatbot, for example, and you want to upload a really large movie or a book, for example, in that context window, and you just want to talk to it, like maybe a research paper, like you want to understand it better, that's a great use case where the big context window is good enough and you don't need to put that in RAG. So I think RAG is still going to be relevant. What is interesting though, speaking of RAG and context windows, is going back to model context protocol. Once we have AIs that are really good at the needle in the haystack problem at a size of 10 million, 10 million tokens, or the 10 million tokens or larger, for example, and then we have this agentic capability to use all these MCP servers, bring the AI where the data is. I think that reduces the need for RAG a bit, right? Because now we have this ability to just query data, massive amounts of data in context where the data lives, as opposed to having to bring that data into a special RAG database. But I do still think RAG will exist even in that once MCP is widespread and we have these really large context windows, because you're still going to want to ground your model in best practices or in your standard operating procedures or things like that to make sure the model is aligned with your use case.
I love it. So one term that I keep hearing is responsible AI, Adam. So what does
Yeah.
that mean, and how does it relate to enterprise organizations?
Yeah, yeah. Responsible AI is so important, and AWS takes that very seriously. We work a lot with our customers on that. And what that really, it means several things, right? So going back to like guardrails, that's along the lines of responsible AI. But why is that? So when you think about creating a generative AI application, it doesn't matter what your use case is. Your users need to know and need to understand that you're using generative AI. Where's the model getting its sources from, like citations. Basically, introducing transparency to your end users is really important and along the lines of responsible AI, because what you don't want to do is break your users' trust, right? By having the model hallucinate, make up things, or maybe the users don't trust it because they don't know where the model got that information from, even if the information is factual. So you really want to provide that transparency, and you can do that with Bedrock guardrails. You can do that with model invocation logging, which is a feature of Bedrock that can send those inputs and outputs and metadata to an S3 bucket or to CloudWatch, where you can kind of provide that transparency and track the accuracy of your model as well. Responsible AI is also about, again, protecting against prompt injection attacks, protecting against getting around guardrails. So, for example, there's been a number of famous cases where certain keywords in natural language, like ChatGPT, for example, many years ago, if you were just to prompt the model with the word Dan, as well as some additional natural language prompting, it would circumvent the guardrails that OpenAI put in place, thus allowing you to ask the model to output things that were inappropriate or not allowed. And so those are kind of things that you also don't want to happen in your use case, especially if you're going into production. So responsible AI encompasses, security. It encompasses being transparent to your end users. It also is about educating your user base too. So if you're in a company, an organization, you don't just want to necessarily force these AI capabilities onto your end users without providing them some information on how to use it, understanding where the information is coming from, and also not blindly trusting the AI. You always want that human in the loop too, that expertise to kind of vet the model's output.
Okay, this next question I'm super curious about, Adam. So you are a Gen AI expert. What Gen AI tools do you use in your day-to-day life?
Oh man, I use Amazon Bedrock every day. I love Amazon Bedrock because it makes so many things easy. Like don't get me wrong, I love LangGraph and LangChain as open source tools. I've also used some other open source tools that some of your viewers may have heard of, such as Light LLM and VLLM, which stands for Very Large Language Model. Those are all kind of ways to self-host your own open source models or do agentic things. Really powerful capabilities and tools, but it does take quite a bit of a learning curve to get those up and running. And that's one reason why I love Amazon Bedrock, because it's you can just, click off it or use Amazon CDK to create your agents, your guardrails, your knowledge base, all these things, and they all integrate, pretty seamlessly too. So you can create an Amazon Bedrock agent, and if you already have your Amazon Bedrock knowledge base for RAG, you can just attach that to your agent, and then boom, your agent has access to your RAG, to your knowledge base. Super awesome and easy. And then from an application standpoint, you can just make an API call to your agent, to your alias ID for your agent, and now you have access to the agent, any tools that the agent has access to in the action group, and then your knowledge base as well as guardrails, all in one kind of package. So it's really nice there. But on like a more personal level too, I love using model context protocol servers and creating my own, as well as something called Cline, Cline, which is a plugin for Visual Studio Code. And Cline acts as an MCP client, and you can choose Amazon Bedrock models. You can choose, models from Hugging Face, self-hosted models, models from the Anthropic API, and so many more. And it's really awesome because it's integrated right into your Visual Studio Code environments. And then I think another tool I love using is Perplexity
Yeah.
for research and searching. I use that more than Google now. Yeah, and I guess the final tool would be Amazon Q Developer. I use that for work stuff because it does a really good job with like OWASP top 10 vulnerabilities, making sure that your code is secure. Amazon Q does better than any other AI coding assistant in terms of following Amazon best practices for coding and like for like Amazon CDK Cloud Development Kit. So I love Amazon Q for that aspect.
On that note, Adam, any tips for folks to get most out of the Gen AI tools that you use?
From an upskilling standpoint, I think that, whether you're an AWS expert or you're getting new, or you're new to IT, or you're a business user, I think having fundamental AI skills is really important for the future of work. So I think the biggest tip is getting really good with prompt engineering, right? Really it's funny, right? Like if you have kids or if you ever had employees or even coworkers, think about giving clear instructions. It sounds easier than it is, right? Like, how hard is it to give clear instructions? But what I've realized, is oftentimes, even as experienced as I am, sometimes I'll just assume
Mm.
that the meaning of my instructions to a model is clear. But then I realize, well, no, it's not. So I think getting really good at no matter what AI tool you're using, especially for prompting, you want to get really good at understanding like how you can be really clear and direct and verbose with your instructions and what you're really, really looking for. Be very clear about that.
That's a great tip. So, final question, Adam. Thanks for coming here. How can people connect with you?
I'm on LinkedIn. That's the best way to connect with me. Hoping to start a YouTube channel like you someday. But yeah, no,
Should.
LinkedIn's the best way to connect with me. And I'd love to talk about Gen AI. And I got a video out there on model context protocol as well.
I'll
And
link it.
if you want to talk about Gen AI, if you're starting on your journey or you're really advanced and you want to talk about this, nerd out, please connect. I'd love to connect with you.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Adam, for sharing your wisdom and taking time off your busy schedule to share the facts, tips, tricks with my viewers.
Thank you so much.